This is a free pattern that came out on AQS, and it was designed by Betsy Langford and Emily Cross. We're going to take and make this for our group, Our Time to Quilt. And if you're one of our members and you'd really like to help make this, we're going to do a block exchange. And that way, when we're all done, each of us will have a wall-hanging size quilt that we can help remember this special time, this difficult and trying, but also a special time for our group. So I'm going to make at least 7 of these because I'm not sure exactly how many members will finally be in the group. And we're going to make the 8-inch finished size, which means they'll be 8.5 raw. And then once we finish making these, we can put each one in an envelope with a stamp and mail them to the other members. So it's not expensive to ship them. It's easy for everyone to do the shipping. So anyway, here we go. I want to tell you what I've first been doing. I found my fabric. So I have this for my background. I did this for the house because we're going to customize ours, and I want it to be my house colors. I've got this gorgeous fabric for the heart, that's the middle of the home, and a nice brown for the roof. And what I just got through doing was using good old spray starch, a heavy-duty spray starch that I buy from Walmart or the grocery store. I starched all of my fabrics. The reason I do that is because I want these blocks to be nice and flat and easy to work with. So I wanted, by putting a little bit of starch on them, it stiffens them, gives them a little firmness, and makes them that much easier to sew accurately. It's just a little thing I do nowadays to make life easier on myself. Okay. So now let me get set up, and I'll cut all of these out. To make it easier on time, I am going to do everything assembly line. So I pressed and starched them all at once, then I'll cut them all at once, then I'll sew them and do chain piecing. And before you know it, I'll have all of my blocks done. What I've done now is I've cut a piece of fabric 10.5 inches wide by 21 inches long. And now I'm going to cut it down into 5-inch squares. And by folding it up this way, I'll save a little time. I love, this is a June Taylor quarter cut ruler. And I have all kinds of her ruler cutting systems. I find they do a magnificent job and really cut my work time in half or more. So I cut it at 0, I'll come cut it at 5, and then I'll cut it at 10. And by making it a little bit longer, it gives me a chance to square it up and not worry about cutting wonky blocks. Alright, so now I have 2 piles of 4 layers, and instead of trying to cut 8 layers at once, which I'm using a 45mm cutter, and I do not want to put that much stress. If I had a 60, I'd probably try it. So what I'm going to be doing right now, let me see. Okay, good. I'm going to square up my edges. I'm going to lay them like this so I can make sure I get a nice accurate cut. Because sometimes when you fold them too much, the ends aren't meeting exactly, and I don't want to have to cut off anything more. And I'm laying them so that they line up on this side, and the edges that are askew run a little long over this way. In fact, you know what I can do? If I open them up this way, now I'll have a total of 4 edges, and I can do 4 layers. 4 layers of them. Okay. So what I first do is I look and see how much I have beyond the 0, how much do I have beyond the 10. Now I know that the folded edges are very accurate, so I'm going to cut. They're laying very uniformly, so I'm going to cut here, and I still leave about 1/8 of an inch that I can trim off. Then I'll go down here and I'll cut on the 0. So now come back to the 5 and cut on the 5. Whoops. Okay. So now here are my scraps. And I now have 8. Enough 5-inch squares. Now I need 2 1.5 by 4.5 inch strips. So what I'm going to do, let's see, what's the best use of fabric? The best use. I'll try not to bother this piece because it's a good size hunk. I think I always try to use up my thinner pieces because there's not quite as much you can do with them. Now this looks like it will make one of the 1.5 by, yes it will. Alright, so then what I'm going to do is cut this off right here. Alright, so now I have a good size piece of fabric. And this is my portable mat that I made some years ago. And it's nice when most of my work putting this block together, I'm going to be on this side of the room. So by laying my cutting board here, I can still cut and protect my ironing surface. Make sure you don't forget and put your iron down on the cutting mat. You will ruin them that way. Sometimes you can try to save them. If it ever happens to you, take and put a damp, hot towel that you iron. Take a wet towel, wring it out, iron it to get it nice and hot. Lay it over the cutting mat and then put heavy, heavy weights on top of it. Sometimes you can get it back. It'll never be perfect, but it might help a little. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4.5. So I'm going to cut these to width and then I'll come back and cut them to length. So 1.5 inches. Then I'll go up to 3 inches because 1.5 and 1.5 are 3. Now I'll go to 4.5 inches and now to 6 inches. And I need 2 per. And let me see how much this would be. Oh, I don't think it's going to be quite big enough. Alright, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have enough for 4. I'll have to do enough for 4 more pairs. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line my pairs up. I can do 4 at a time. So 4 there, 4 right here. And these are going to be cut to 4 1/2. So I line up the line on this cutting ruler with the bottom edge of the fabric. That makes sure that I cut it squarely. And then I'll come cut it on 4.5. And these can go in the scrap bag. I'll cut this one with the next few that I do. So I need 2 times 4 would be 8, so I can do it with 7. Okay. Seven times 1.5 would be 7 and 3.5, 10.5. So I'm going to cut a strip 11 inches. And I only need to make it 4.5 inches. So I know if I cut along here, I'll have plenty to do 4.5. I was estimating, trying to shoot for a 4.5 inch piece. Okay. Yep, and it's 5 inches. I was trying to shoot for a 5-inch piece so I can cut them down to 4.5 inches. Alright, and I'm going to lay this smoothly on the end of that. And three, 4.5, 6, 7.5, 9, and 10.5, because I had the other one cut. So now what I'm going to do is lay them down so I can get a nice cut on each end. And remember, I cut them slightly longer so I could get nice crisp cuts. Alright, so I lay 4 here because I only cut 4 at a time. Line them up evenly, so what you do on one, you do to the other. That way they'll be accurate. Alright. Now lay my June Taylor ruler back down. Okay. Line up this line with the bottom here. Make sure they look really straight and even. I leave a little bit here. Come in and cut at 0. Then come over here. Cut 4.5. Alright. Now I am done with all of these. Now I'm cutting the roof section, which requires, I need 8 5-inch square blocks. With this scrap fabric, I noticed that I have this right here that has a section cut out, and I measured and saw that it's about almost 5 inches. So it'll give me a chance to cut off this rough torn edge and to still have a 4.5 inch long piece. And that's what I'm looking for. It's 4.5, 1.5 by 4.5. So I'm going to place the 4.5 right here so I can cut off that edge, and here at 0. Now I have a 4.5 inch by length, and what I'm going to do is see how many 1.5 inch strips I can get out of this. I'll go 1.5, 3, 4.5. It's going to leave me just a fraction short, and I can deal with it. More, cut the 1.5s down to 1.25, and then turn them widthwise and go from there. Okay, now they're 1 1/4. And I'll see how many I can cut, because I need 4 each. Because I usually always cut my smallest pieces last. Sometimes cutting your other measurements will give you just enough for that small cut. So now I always like to cut at the end that's already been cut and messed with. And the reason that is because I'd like to leave as much clean usable fabric on this piece as possible. The next size pieces I need are 3 by 3s. So I'll come in here and leave leave a little edge that I clean up and come do 3 and 6. Now let's see how many pieces I'll get out of that. Okay, I'll cut this. Now these I'm going to have to neaten up the edges, because these are not usable pieces down here. So I lined them up pretty even so I can come in and put the ruler, get it even along the bottom, and then come nip those messy edges off. All right, now three, 6, 9, and 12. Very good. I got all 8. I just had this little piece left over. And now look at what size this is. This is what I meant about not making a special cut, because I can perfectly use this piece. There I go. I now have my background pieces, my house pieces, my roof pieces, and my heart pieces. So the first step, the pattern says, is to make 8 half square triangles. Now, I'm going to show you a method I use, but first, the method that most people use. That's where you take your light colored square, you run a ruler right down the diagonal line carefully, and then I'm going to use a friction pin, and I'm going to draw a line right down the center with the friction pin. And that way you know how to sew 1/4 inch on each side of this line. Now, I love shortcuts. So what I'm going to do is press these squares in half diagonally. And I'll press 2 at a time. Press them diagonally with the iron, making sure you got them right on the point. Making sure all the points line up. This, to me, is much easier and faster than drawing the line on fabric. I've always hated drawing the line on fabric. So see what I do when I fold it in half and I press it, then when you open it, you've got the diagonal line. If you want to make drawing on the actual fabric easier, then you can take a piece of sandpaper, glue it to a piece of heavy cardboard or foam core board, but you can take sandpaper, lay your fabric on the sandpaper, and the sandpaper helps hold the fabric to keep it from scooching as you draw. But I find that this pressing goes so much faster, and then I can spend more time sewing. Alright, I have gray thread in my bobbin and gray thread in the top. And what I will do is take one light and one dark 5-inch square of fabric, putting right sides together. And then I will take and sew 1/4 of an inch from the line. And I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance marked here. And then with this first one, I'll just spin it around like this and start down the other side. Then with chain piecing, I'll grab another 5-inch square, put them, another pair, put them to right sides together, and then off I go sewing again. Now, what I'm going to show you is how I cut these apart. Some people put them on their cutting mat and use a rotary cutter, but I prefer to do the trimming all at one time. So I'd come down the center, but as I get close to the edge, I swoop out this way to cut those dog ears off, and I swoop out this way to cut those dog ears off. And that way, once I iron them, they're all ready to go. To iron them, I always iron to the dark. So I place the dark up, slide my iron in sideways. That way I'm not stretching my bias. One more time. I want to iron them to the dark, so leave the dark on top. Slide your iron in sideways. That way you don't stress your bias. Now, I'm going to trim these to 4.5 inches square. So I have my 1, 2, 3, 4.5 inch ruler. I line this line up with the 45-inch diagonal line right through here. And that will help me trim it up. And it looks like it's absolutely, that one's good. Here are my brown and white or rooftop half square triangles. So the next thing, it wants me to sew the two pairs together so they resemble a rooftop. Here are my rooftop section. Now that's done, I'll take sections D and section C, do the same thing I did before, iron 1/2 or mark them with your pen, whichever you prefer. Now I'll sew these together, right sides together. Now I'm taking the 2.5 inch half square triangles and I'm trimming them to a true 2.5 inch. And this is important because every step builds on the next step. It's not hard, it just takes attention. Alright. So what I do is this ruler has a 1/2 inch built on this outside edge. So as long as I line the diagonal along this 45-degree line and line up two sides against here, then I can trim off anything that's larger. Okay, all these are pressed in half. So now I will be sewing the pieces to the top of the red squares. This will make the top of the heart. In this case, I'm not making a half square triangle, so I just need to sew right along the fold line. And I dropped my stitch length down a couple because this is just a little bit tricky. It's not very much, it's a tiny piece to sew on, and I want to make sure I have plenty of stitches to hold it in place. And in this one, if anything, do sew one scant thread to the outside of the block, because that will give you room to fold the fabric over without leaving it short, and I'll show you that in a minute. But when you put this on the corner, so just barely a thread's width to the outside of the block, because this is going to be flipped up to that outside edge, and you want to leave it a thread width to flip over neatly. Okay, now all of the heart tops are done. Now you take and sew these two together. You sew together all the pairs of heart tops. Now I'll press these heart tops. Out of all the blocks, this one has given me the most trouble. I have taken it apart out here, turned it around. This is my, altogether about my 6th time trying to make this work. I'm not sure what happened, but it's given me a fit. I'm going to try one more time. And that's it, because otherwise I'm going to chew up the fabric too much. One more time. The little triangles in the corners must not have been very accurate on one of these, and that throws everything off. So that's why cut accurately, sew accurately. This is the last time. Let's hope I get it close enough. It's not perfect, but it's going to have to do. This is the problem, and this is why 3 times, I always say, is the most I will take out any fabric. Since it's a little raveled, I'm going to take and put a little fray check along this seam. I am putting the heart top with the heart bottom . Now I'll press these and I'll be right back. I've noticed that these are a lot of seams coming together in a small area for this fabric. So what I'm going to do is come in here and do what's called grading the seams. If any of you have ever made clothes, you will know what grading the seams is. And I'm going to cut the underneath of the seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. And this way, when I go to press it, let's see if it makes a difference. I'm pressing it now. I think it lays much flatter. So I'm going to come along and grade these seam allowances on all of this, and I'm just taking off one of them down to 1/8 of an inch, and that way it just eases in all of that fabric. So here is the piece before. Let's see now what it's going to look like after. Definitely much flatter. Definitely much flatter. Now you might notice over here, oh, well this, this doesn't line up. But once you sew this in a seam, it will be fine. And this doesn't come to the end, it's because it's not supposed to. Once you sew it into a seam, it will be fine. And it's the underneath one that I'm trimming down. If you trim the top one, then you'd have the seam stick out. But since it's underneath, this will kind of cover it, make it smoother. In fact, I might... Okay, I think you can see the difference it makes. Now I'll get busy and do the rest. Now I'm going to trim these up to 4.5 inches. I'm going to be making the house, wall, and the sky. When it comes time to press, what I like to do is put all my dark sides up top, seams to the right, so they're facing the same direction, the dark up top. This saves time when you're actually dealing with the heavy iron. And remember, I like a heavy iron because I feel like it gives a better press. Alright, so I hold the dark side up. That way when I press, the seam allowance goes to the dark side. And see how I slide it in parallel to the stitching line so I don't stretch or distort anything. Now I take and put one on either side of the heart. I put the green touching the green. Now I've pressed them. I'll put this strip on the other side. keeping greens together. Now I'm going to sew these two pieces together, and we're all done with our 8 blocks. Eight and a half by 8.5, pretty good. Here are the blocks, and it's not much harder to make 8 than to just do 1. You just do that chain piecing, do them in a row, and then there you go. So I have a couple little things to do to these, and then they'll be ready to go out in the mail.